Hello and welcome to this session. My name is Shian Nafti. I'm an authorized trainer for Google. I travel around the world delivering training to Google's clients and partners. And in the next few minutes, we're going to go through HTTP load balancing and Cloud CDN on the Google Cloud Platform. There's a lot to cover, so let's get right in. We're going to start off by enabling the Compute API. Having enabled the Compute Engine API, we're going to go right in and create a number of virtual machines. The first virtual machine we're going to create will be in the US, and this virtual machine will be for HTML-based content. We're going to add a startup script while creating the virtual machine that enables a web server to be installed or configured within the virtual machine. And we're also going to configure a custom HTML page that displays the text web-html. Having created the first virtual machine, we're going to create a second virtual machine also in the US. This second virtual machine will be for video-based content. We're also going to install the web server, the Apache web server, within the virtual machine using a startup script. And we're going to create a custom HTML page that displays the text web-video when content from the root directory is served, as well as content from a subfolder /video. In Europe, we're going to create two virtual machines as well, one for HTML content and the other for video content. The virtual machines in Europe are going to be created in an identical manner to the virtual machines we've just created in the US. And now we're going to create a virtual machine for video-based content also in Europe. With all virtual machines created, let's go to the web console. I'm going to go to the Compute Engine section, select VM instances, and you can see here there are 4 virtual machines in total. 2 of those virtual machines are in Europe and 2 are in the US. I'm going to filter based on zones. In each zone, we have an HTML instance and a video instance. If you select any of these instances, you should be able to view additional configuration information. For example, the machine type, the IP addresses, both internal as well as external IP. If you scroll down to the custom metadata section, you should be able to see the startup script that enables us to install an Apache web server at startup time, as well as configure a custom HTML page. We're going to move on to the next step. Step number 3, and in step number 3 we're going to create an unmanaged instance group, and once the unmanaged instance groups have been created, we're going to add the virtual machines we just created into these unmanaged instance groups. Let's start off by creating the unmanaged instance groups first. So here we've just created an unmanaged instance group for our video based instances in the US. We're going to create an unmanaged instance group for HTML instances in the US. We're going to create 2 unmanaged instance groups, one for video-based instances and the other for HTML-based instances in Europe. Great, so now we have 4 unmanaged instance groups, 2 in Europe and 2 in the US. Let's carry on and add the instances that we currently have created into these instance groups. We're going to start by adding the video instance in the US to the video instance group also in the US. We're going to add the HTML instance in the US to the HTML instance group in the US. Next, we're going to add the HTML instance in the US to the HTML instance group in the US. And we're going to repeat what we've just done in Europe as well. And also add the HTML instance in Europe to the HTML instance group in Europe. Let's take a look at the web console and explore what we've just done. Here we can see the instance groups we just created. I'm going to select one at random. Let's select the HTML instance group in the US. Having selected the HTML instance group in the US, you can see the HTML instance within that instance group. This seems to have been configured properly. In the next step, which is step number 4, we're going to configure the ports for these instance groups. So here we're setting the name of the port for the video instance group in the US, and you can see that the name port is http://80. We're going to do the same for all of the instance groups. Let's verify what we have just configured on the web console. To do this, we're going to go to Instance Groups. Let's select one of these instance groups. I'm going to select the video instance group in Europe. Let's have a look at the Details tab. And you can see here the port name mapping, and this confirms that incoming traffic is directed to port 80 through the name port HTTP. Now we're going to move on to the next step, which is step number 5. In this section, we're going to configure a basic health check and backend services. In this step, we're configuring a basic health check for HTTP traffic on port 80. Having created the health check, we're now creating a backend service for video content using the health check we just created, as well as specifying the protocol for the backend service. Next, we're creating a backend service for HTML-based content using the HTTP protocol, as well as the health check we previously created. You may also notice that both of these backend services are global services, so they are accessible from any region around the world. Let's have a look at the backend services we've just created on the console. Let's go back to the web console and explore the backend services we've just created. To do that, we need to go to the networking section. Select load balancing under network services. Under load balancing, let's select backends. And here you can see the two backend services. We have a backend service for HTML content and a backend service for video content. Let's click on the backend service for video content. Here you can see the protocol that was specified. You may recall that we also associated this service with a health check, and the health check was the health check we created previously. And you can see the configuration reflected on this page. The next step is step number 6. And in step number 6, we're going to create a URL map and a target HTTP proxy. The URL map and the target HTTP proxy enables us to be able to direct incoming requests to services that are running within the Google Cloud Platform. So let's explore how this works. We'll select option 6. The first thing we're going to do is create a URL map. The name we're specifying is www, reflecting the fact that this enables us to map incoming requests to services running within the cloud. So we're creating a URL map and we're specifying the default service that all incoming requests should be forwarded to. And the default service is the HTML backend service. Having created the URL map and specified the default service, we're now going to add additional paths that specify routes to the other services. What we're doing in the next command is ensuring that any request for a path that is /video or /video/ anything else should be forwarded to the video backend service. Next, let's create a target HTTP proxy. And you can see here that while creating the target HTTP proxy, we specify the URL map that defines the rules for forwarding requests to backend services. Let's go to the console and select load balancing. Under load balancing, you can see here the URL map that we created. We have a green tick, which means the backend services have been configured correctly. Let's click on the URL map. You can see here the path matcher. You may recall that we specified a default backend. The default backend was the HTML backend service. Additionally, we specified two paths, /video and /video/star. And for these two paths, we specified the backend as the video backend service. At the bottom here, you can see the configuration for the backends. The next step is step number 7. And in step number 7, we're going to configure forwarding rules. But before we do that, we need to create an IP address, a global IP address that will be used by users around the world to access the services. Let's save this IP address as an environment variable. And now we're creating a forwarding rule. The forwarding rule essentially specifies the global IP address that will be used to access services, as well as the target proxy. Let's go to the console and explore the forwarding rule we have just configured. To do that, we need to go to the load balancing section and select front ends. Here you can see the forwarding rule. The scope is global. That's the global IP address specified. That's the port. And the protocol is HTTP. This global forwarding rule is linked to a URL map that defines the rules for forwarding requests to backend services. The next step is step number 8. And in step number 8, we're going to create a firewall rule that will allow incoming traffic through the load balancer that will be used to access services running within the Google Cloud environment. Google specifies a range of IP addresses that we need to define as the source range when configuring the firewall rule. Having created the firewall rule, we're going to go to the console and explore the configuration for the firewall rule. To do that, we need to go to the networking section, select VPC Network Firewall Rules. Here you can see the firewall rule we just created. Let's click on it to view the configuration. The firewall rule was created against the default network. The priority is 1000, which is lower or at a much higher priority than the default firewall rules. The direction is ingress, which is incoming traffic. We're allowing incoming traffic from these IP ranges. The protocol and the port is TCP port 80. Let's return to our console. In step number 9, we're going to add the backend services to instance groups, as well as configure scaling. In this step, we're adding the video backend service to the video instance group in the US and configuring scaling. Next, we're going to do the same for the HTML backend service. So we're adding the HTML backend service to the HTML instance group and also configuring scaling. We're going to repeat this for the resources in Europe. Let's explore the backend services configuration on the console. To do that, we need to select Network Services within the networking section and select Load Balancing. Under Load Balancing, we select the backends, and here we can see the backend services. Let's click on one of the backend services. Going to select the HTML backend service. You can see here the two instance groups, the one in the US and the one in Europe. If we scroll to the right, you can see the backend utilization, currently 0%. And if you scroll to the bottom, you can view additional configuration for the backend service. In the next step, that's step number 10, we're going to create virtual machines in Europe and in the US for test purposes. Here we're creating a virtual machine in Asia. So we're going to load test from the Asia region. We're using a utility called Siege. So we're going to install Siege within this virtual machine. We're going to create a virtual machine as well in Europe using a similar configuration with Siege for load testing. And we're going to repeat the same as well for the US. And now let's create the virtual machine in the US. Great, so we now have 3 virtual machines for testing purposes. Let's go to our console and have a look and make sure those virtual machines are all up and running and ready. So we're going to go to Compute Engine, VM Instances. And you can see here we have the Asia load test virtual machine, Europe load test, and US load test. Right, so everything seems to be good. Let's go back to our console, and that's the terminal, and generate some load. We're going to execute step number 11. Now we're going to SSH into the virtual machine in Asia and invoke the load balancer endpoint across 150 concurrent connections using Siege. Let's generate load using the VM in Asia. We previously generated load against the backend service for HTML content. Let's generate load against the video service backend. Next, we're going to log into the virtual machine in the US and generate load against the HTML backend. The server is now under siege. Let's log in to the virtual machine in the US and generate load against the video backend service. So here we're generating load against the HTML service in Europe. And finally, we're going to log on to the virtual machine in Europe and generate load against the video service in Europe. Let's go to the console and explore the traffic that's being generated. To do that, we need to go to Network Services, Load Balancing. Let's select the URL map. We'll then go to Monitoring. You can see here traffic flowing to the 2 backends. That's the video service as well as the HTML backend service. Let's select one of the backend services. Here we can see traffic from Asia. Traffic from Asia is being forwarded to the instance group in the US. Traffic from North America is also flowing to the instance group in the US. Traffic from Europe is being forwarded to the instance group in Europe. You can see here that a few errors were generated. And we can also see the request per second, the level of utilization across the 2 instances. We can view these over the last hour, the last 6 hours. I've had this running for a few minutes, so we have data less than an hour. Let's have a look at the video backend. Likewise, for the video backend, we have exactly the same traffic flow. So that's it. In terms of traffic routing, the main message here is that the load balancer intelligently forwards request to the closest instance. So the US region is closest to Asia when compared to the European region, and that's why traffic from Asia is being forwarded to the US Central 1 region, and traffic from Europe is being kept within the European region. Let's carry on and explore the additional load balancing options. To do this, we're going to move to option 12. And in option 12, we're going to create a cloud storage bucket. We're creating this cloud storage bucket in Europe. Having created the cloud storage bucket, we're ensuring that all users can access objects within the bucket. Next, we're copying an image, a 20 megabytes image, into the cloud storage bucket in the subfolder static. Let's verify that the image has been copied over. To do that, I'm going to select the storage service under the storage section. Going to click on Browse. Here we're going to select the cloud storage bucket. You can see access is public. Let's select the cloud storage bucket. And here we have the static folder. Let's click on the static folder. And here we can see the image. Everything looks good. Let's return to our console. Next, step number 13. We're going to modify our URL map and add a storage service as a backend. In this step, we have just created a new backend of the type bucket. Next, we're going to remove the existing URL map and create a new URL map that has a path to this new storage backend. The existing URL map has been deleted. Let's create the new URL map. You can see that the default storage service is still the HTML backend service. We haven't changed that. You can see that we're defining a new path to the storage bucket, and the path is referred, and the URL to the backend bucket is /static. You can also see that we've preserved the path to the video service. Let's add this new path to the URL map. We now have access to the cloud storage bucket configured. In step number 14, we're going to enable CDN, that's the Content Distribution Network. Here we're enabling CDN on the static backend bucket. Having enabled CDN, we're now going to generate load against the static bucket. To do that, we're going to SSH into the virtual machine in Asia, and we're going to invoke a request to the static bucket. You can see here the time it's taking for each of those requests. Let's go ahead and do the same using the VM in the US. So let's generate load against the backend bucket. Okay, and let's also generate load from Europe. Having generated some load, let's go back to our console. Let's explore the backend configuration. We'll go to Network Services Load Balancing. Let's select Backends. And here you can see the backend we just created. The load balancer for the backend is the load balancer we created previously. Let's select the backend. That's the configuration for the backend. CDN is currently enabled against this backend. Under load balancer, if we click on the URL map, which is the load balancer, at the bottom, you can see here under backend, you can see a reference to the backend bucket. That's the name of the bucket, and CDN is enabled. Hello, welcome back. I've been running the load test now for about 10 minutes. So let's go and have a look at what's happening. We should have quite a lot of load generated. So I'm going to go to Network Services Load Balancing. Let's select, or let's just click on the URL map. Select Monitoring. Have a look at the static backend. That's what we're interested in. And you can see here that 100% of the content is now being served from the cache. And that's what we expected. So that concludes this session. Hope you found it interesting. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.